Scripture lesson is from the Gospel of Jesus Christ according to Matthew. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to them, "All these I will give to you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, 'Worship the Lord your God, and serve only him.'" May our hearts and minds be inspired by this wisdom.
Thanks be to God.
So today we conclude our series of little-known books of the Bible with the book of Titus. So who can tell me anything they know about the book of Titus? Anything?
Not a minor prophet.
It is not a minor prophet. 2 points to Mr. Keller. That is true. Very good, very good. What kind of book is it?
It's up in the epistle section.
It is an epistle! 10 points to Mr. Keller. Very nice, very nice. This is the only book that we are doing from the New Testament. As a Christian church, we preach from the New Testament more often than the Old, so it's easier to find unknown books in the Old Testament than the New. So Titus is one of the epistles. It's a letter supposedly written by Paul, right? Paul wrote a lot of the letters, or supposedly wrote a lot of the letters, at least. So we're not sure exactly when this could have been written. If it was actually written by Paul, it was probably written around the year 60. Remember, Paul's letters, the epistles, are actually older texts than any of the Gospels. Paul actually lived before the Gospel writers, even though Paul never actually met Jesus. But some people question whether this is actually Paul's writing. For one thing, it's written to Titus, who's at the church in Crete. And there's no concrete evidence in the Bible that Paul was involved in that church. Furthermore, some suggest it might be a later date because we're actually starting to see maybe some political and cultural rhetoric creep into our biblical texts. A lot of people have problems with some of these mandates that we find here in Titus. They say here we find the texts about that's not what I was looking for. About respecting those in authority. We find the text about respecting those in authority here in Titus. And for those social justice Christians who see Jesus as coming to bring a new way of life here on earth, the crusaders among us, they don't want to hear much about respecting their authorities. And of course, more negative about this text of Titus is that it is one of those problems texts that talks about slavery. It talks about slaves be submissive to your masters. And of course, we can't overlook the tragic role that some Christian churches did play in continuing the tragedy of slavery by looking at texts like this and thinking that it gave God lending support to tragic structures such as slavery. But what's very interesting about Titus is that you lose a lot of it again in the English from the Greek. They're talking about slavery. This is a big, one of the issues with our biblical texts. And the word in Greek for slave is doulos. But the thing is, that word doulos can also be translated as servant. And here, right in the very first part of the very first verse of this very first chapter, we see Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. He's saying, Paul, I am a slave of Jesus Christ. And later he talks about being a slave of our passions and this and that. Now, I don't want to downplay at all the tragedy that slavery was as a social institution in our country, but I think he's a little nuanced when he uses this word doulos, encouraging us all to be slaves to our Jesus, our Christ. And in that slavery and confining of our own freedoms in that way, I think we'd all understand how horrendous it would be to ever submit another human individual to slavery. So the discussion of slaves throughout this small book of Titus is a little nuanced. It's a little more complex than you would think. But this is what I love about the book of Titus. There's a lot of difficult stuff in there, I'm not going to lie. But after it's talking about the slaves and stuff, it says, to speak evil of no one, to show every courtesy of everyone. To speak evil of no one. Now I'd like to put it in context a little bit. Supposedly this letter is written to the church in Crete. Now we still use a term to this day to describe a group of violent, marauding, maybe even young, annoying, rule-breaking people. They're a bunch of Cretans, right? You ever think about the term Cretan comes from people in Crete? These were not well-behaved people. These were notoriously unwell-behaved people where this church is located. And here their advice is to speak evil of no one, to show every courtesy to everyone. In a lot of our biblical texts, we get advice about how to learn and interact and deal with other Christians. But here it's really talking about everyone. You know, you can look at people and you can see the best in them, or you can look at people and you can see the worst in them. And when there is a balance shift in the people who hold these two different perspectives, then the whole culture can change, and the whole world can change. There are people who look at people and see the negatives, and there are people who look at people and see the positives. And when that balance between those people shifts, the entire culture can shift. When a culture shifts, the world can shift. I invite you to take a look at Titus. It's only 3 chapters long. You'll find it in your New Testament in the tiny little letters in the back. See how it provokes you. And I encourage you to let those words of maybe Paul sit with you. Speak evil of no one, even the Cretans. Show every courtesy to everyone. Amen.